It's FAQ NYC Off Cycle, where the New Yorkers podcast from the newsroom by and for New Yorkers, the city, steps back to take different and deeper looks into some of the things that are always happening here in the only place in the world. I'm Harry Siegel, here with Dr. Christina Greer and Katie Honan, as we all wanted to be here to chat with and welcome back ace journalist and friend of the pod, Sally Goldenberg, who's returning to New York City as Politico's new senior New York editor from a year in the national wilderness covering the Republican presidential primary and Ron DeSantis' campaign. So Sally will join us right after this quick programming note from Katie.
FAQ NYC is part of The City, a nonprofit, nonpartisan newsroom serving the people of New York. As a nonprofit, we really depend on your donations to keep us going. Our investigations, explainers, FAQ episodes, our reporters and editors, we all depend on readers and listeners like you. So please make your gift today. Go to thecity.nyc/give. Any amount helps, but the best way to support is to set up an automatic monthly donation, because those help us to plan for the future. If you already have a monthly donation, you can always make a special extra gift. So go to thecity.nyc/give to make your donation today. Again, that's thecity.nyc/give. Thanks for listening. And with that, Sally, welcome back and let's jump right in.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Of course, Sally, we're very, very happy to have you back. I think it wasn't a full year that you were covering the rest of the country, but it sure felt like it.
Yeah.
So I guess our first question is, what did you learn about, or what new perspective do you have now on New York City after your time covering this national presidential horse race? And as you've been watching New York City coverage from more of a distance, what was sort of the biggest takeaway you got from all that?
So, well, thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be back. A good question. I would say, I was covering Republicans, and primarily, as Harry mentioned, Ron DeSantis. And I think the takeaway for me, kind of as it relates to New York, I had many takeaways that were national, but it was interesting to hear rhetoric from the Republican Party that just isn't so different from the mayor of New York, who's a Democrat. I'm not talking obviously about, social issues and abortion, right, but in terms of border security and in terms of the antipathy toward the left wing of the Democratic Party, particularly the younger, much more self-identified progressive wing, that sort of conflict is not so different when spoken by Ron DeSantis as it is by the Democratic mayor of New York, Eric Adams. And so I thought that was kind of validating, because I think in New York, sometimes when we're covering him, we say he leans right or he's conservative. And I at least would get pushback oh, you don't know what a real conservative is. And now I feel okay, but now I do. And it really speak very similarly on border security. So I thought that was interesting. I think the New York national storyline that I found most interesting, besides George Santos, which is a crazy one-off, was the relationship between Biden and Adams over the border. Just endlessly fascinating to me that the New York City mayor is openly attacking, a Democratic president who's of the same ilk as he is politically, ostensibly, has a similar base of voters. I just found that super interesting. And then, New York stories that popped were the Adams investigations, the Winnie Greco story that the city's done that I can't say enough good about, was just a fabulous story. Just fabulous. And
we didn't force you to say that. Thank you.
No, it was so good. It's just to have people admitting that a top aide to the mayor was using her position for blatant corruption was just great journalism. But the corruption surrounding Adams, I don't know if it's touching him yet. I guess none of us do, but it's certainly everywhere and it's unignorable. I'm sure I missed tons of smaller stories along the way, but that was, that's big, and I assume getting bigger.
So, Sally, welcome back. We love having you on the pod. For our listeners, they may know I call you Sally CBS. Sally comes with receipts longer than CBS whenever she writes a story. I talk a lot about, especially Harry and Katie's writing in the city has just been phenomenal these past few months, especially. What are you most looking forward to doing? We know you start officially next week. What what are three things you've got your eye on, especially as an editor, which is that a slightly different focus? Like, explain to me, will you be on the ground writing and researching, or are you 30,000 feet trying to direct stories? Like, what do you have your eye on these days?
Probably not. Yeah, I'm going to do more managing and assigning and editing the copy than writing.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully not from 30,000 feet though. But yeah, I think I'm going to manage the team in New York City and then kind of oversee Albany, but there's an editor there. So my focus, and also because the news is just so hot right now in New York, I think that's my main focus, is to get in and just sort of get the team that's been working on the story focused on a few storylines that, they're pursuing that I think they need to dig deeper into, because there's so many tentacles to this story. So I definitely want to focus on the Adams, investigations and how that's impacting city government. I'm also interested in the budget cuts. I don't, I have to get up to speed on them, but Adams has done a series of budget cuts, and there's a lot of, they seem very fraught, and people are protesting them. And I don't know yet whether I know Harry's done some good, did a good column on this. I guess I'm trying to get my head around, is that, are these haircuts and activists are just complaining because that's what they do? Or are these really substantive cuts, which they certainly seem to be from the coverage? So I want to get us sort of digging deeper into that, especially ahead of the budget announcement, that comes every January, February. And I also want to, since Albany is now in my portfolio, I want to really figure out what the legislative races next year are saying about the political trends in New York. Because even though New York is a blue state, we have seen, especially in, a few of the city council races, there were some Republican or conservative Democratic successes that I don't know would have happened in, in 2018 when there was a progressive wave. So I really want to hone in on those legislative races in Albany next year, throughout the state, but also as they pertain to New York City. And of course, the midterms, since the midterms were so, since the congressional races in New York were so decisive last year, or last cycle, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
And we still have the question of what maps we're necessarily going to have for those races, which is this weird zombie question that somehow has never fully gone away. But Sally, before we lock in entirely on New York stuff, I do want to ask you two things about your national takeaways. First, just to meditate for a minute on what you've seen and how things feel within the Republican Party and west of the Hudson, I guess. And secondly, in relation to that, with Adams, as you were saying, he can sound a lot like Republicans on border security and some other issues. At the same time, he's saying Republicans, Abbott in particular, but it's something DeSantis was also involved in, we're targeting Black-run cities, as he put it, cities run by Black mayors. And I just love to know how all of that is getting heard or repeated or ignored in the national Republican discourse, since we all have sometimes a myopic focus here inside the city.
So I'll take that one first because it popped in my head when you asked it. When I started on the beat, and really throughout the time I was on the beat, I spent a lot of time watching Fox News because DeSantis went on Fox News, and continues to all the time, as you would imagine a Republican presidential candidate would. And, so I'd see the chyron, I think it's what, the banner under as someone was speaking. And sometimes he'd be getting interviewed with someone and that would say New York City mayor. And obviously this is Fox and they're very anti-Biden, which I'm sure all the listeners know, but I should just say that. And, the banners would say Democratic New York City mayor agrees that Biden is mishandling border security. So it is being fed directly to Republican viewers. I don't know. I don't think I've seen an ad on it from a Republican. Wouldn't surprise me if I did, but I don't think I've seen one yet. But it is definitely a talking point or a data point among Republicans that a high-profile Democrat is criticizing the president on his handling of border security. That is not lost on people. It's not the main thing they talk about, but it's definitely, they consider it a point that bolsters their argument against Biden, saying that he's mishandling this. And I'm sorry, your first question was just kind of my takeaway on the state of the Republican primary and the race.
And how that feels nationally. Like, honestly, I didn't know that the country west of the Hudson fully existed until I was like in my mid-20s, outside of Chicago and LA. And it's different out there. And you've been spending the time and doing the work, and you're about to be right back here in New York City, the only place in the world. So I just wanted to
And Albany, don't forget,
about...
Harry. Don't forget. I know you didn't know about Albany either growing up, but
so the race itself is just not much of a race. You know, when I started the race, I think it was March 1st, I think was my first day or second or whatever. Trump hadn't been indicted yet. DeSantis hadn't announced yet. His numbers in Florida were very good. And he was riding high, and he was considered a kind of top tier alternative to Trump. And I think folks always assumed it would be hard to beat Trump in this primary because he's dominant and he is the Republican Party. And that was really my main takeaway. That is not news to people who follow national politics, but to me, who like only, watched it from a remove, like the fact that like the party just is Trump. The donors who say they're not MAGA, they're fine with Trump. They say they're not. Now they are getting behind Nikki Haley, and some of them do hate Trump. For sure, the Koch brothers are getting behind Nikki Haley. But like, I talked to so many people I would consider moderate Republicans who like outwardly say they hate Trump, but then when you pull a layer back, they really don't. They don't. I think if they did, because his negatives are pretty high, I think if they did, there would have been a corralling behind probably someone like Nikki Haley. Ron DeSantis is actually very similar to Trump in policy and in like isolationist policy. He follows the MAGA thread of the Republican Party, which is much different than the kind of traditional conservative strain. But I think the sort of anti-Trump faction is big enough if it all got together and united behind, I don't know, whomever, Tim Scott, who's out now, Mike Pence, who's out now, Nikki Haley. And the fact that they never did, and there was never like a coalescing around someone, kind of tells me they're really not that bothered by Trump because, he's dominant, and like he gave rich people a tax break, and he told poor people like he'll do what needs to be done for them, or working class people, and they believe him, even though a lot of what he said never happened. And he's just extremely dominant, and he's dominant in, like, I spent a lot of time in Iowa and a lot of time with evangelical Christians. Everything they espouse with family values is, different from how we all know Trump conducts his life. Doesn't matter. They don't just like Trump. They believe Trump is like, or has been like, given this position by God, like, and that it's ungodly to be opposed to him. So the hold he has over this party is, while numerically, like I said, if you look at polls, there are a lot, maybe not a majority anymore, but certainly a majority when I started, who wanted someone else to be the nominee. He still has such a grip on the party. And then you add in these 4 indictments, or is it 4? I think it's 91 counts, and I believe it was 4 separate cases.
Yeah, 4 states, 91 counts.
Right, 91 counts. And you add that in, and you add in this sort of performance he does every time about being, targeted by the deep state. And he's a stand-in for every American who feels unfairly targeted by the system. It's very appealing to people. And he's just stronger than I guess I realized going in.
So I got a quick question, Sally, sticking with the national, because we have heard that, white evangelicals especially are just completely bogus. This is a thrice married man who's, cheated on his wives and all the things. So we have to also factor in just utter nonsense and racism when it comes to a certain portion of that population. But what about Nikki Haley? This idea, I know certain people are trying to coalesce around her, but we've also seen this country does not like women, especially in executive roles. And she is, as much as Nimrata tries to move away from it, she's also a woman of color. So is this just a pipe dream for Republicans trying to, I know that certain people want anyone but Trump, even though secretly they're like, these tax breaks are way too good to walk away from. But do you think that she could be the nominee, sort of having had those conversations in Iowa and across the country, I'm not like Harry. I do believe that like there are places to live other than New York, especially Baltimore, my favorite city. But I spent high school in the red part of the state, so I argue all states are red states. It's just, do you live in the blue part in the major city? So having spent that time in Illinois, these people aren't totally foreign to me in a lot of ways. So where does Nikki Haley really factor into this, knowing what we know about female executive leadership?
Yeah, that's a good question. Nikki Haley's problem is Trump, not to like sound like a broken record. Her main problem is just Trump. Like
Yeah.
he is the party. He has changed the party. He runs the just I was just like stunned by how many people who say who say they don't like him and say they don't agree with him are also with him. So that's, I think, her main problem. And I will say, people said things to me that would undoubtedly be called racist and sexist by Democrats. And I was surprised sometimes by things I heard. And it was more directed to Vivek Ramaswamy. I heard so many people call him Vikram, but not like saying it like, oh, I like Vikram. He's good too. I just like Trump better. I'm like, that's not his name. So there was a lot of that. I was at a conference in Iowa where he was asked, and again, they like he's like a mini Trump. They like him politically, but someone said to him, the problem for you in Iowa, and I don't think it was meant to be like a nasty question. It was like, how do you overcome the fact that you're Hindu and we're a Christian state? I didn't hear that much of that type of talk toward Nikki Haley. I think her name and, her appearance are more ambiguous. In fact, there was a story in a paper that it's called the Florida Standard. It's the origins of the paper are a little mysterious, but it appears to be like a front for Ron DeSantis. And there was a story that was just like polling, quote unquote, Floridians to see, did you know her real name? And there were quotes like, now that I know her birth name, I think she's shady. It was so blatant. So that is out there for sure. I just can't say that I heard a ton of it. I mostly what I heard about her was in the negative column. It was like, she's not really taking on Trump enough. She's just avoiding that question altogether. And in the positive column, it was like, she's the one who can actually go up against him in the party. But that decision came so late. It came like a week ago. But I'm sure you're right. I'm sure that those discriminatory strains that people have, I think, frankly, throughout the country, Democrats and Republicans, that would come into play. I just didn't hear it so blatantly on the trail. Because she was also pretty irrelevant until pretty recently.
Just speaking of mega folks, Lee Zeldin lost to Kathy Hochul, of course, but he lost by like 5 points. Democrats still have supermajorities in both houses of the legislature. But you can feel some of these forces looming here are trying to find places of purchase. There's this interesting Casamatides orbit who now owns WABC, which has nothing to do with TV ABC, where you've got everyone from like Roger Stone to Andrew Cuomo appearing on the same airwaves. So real quick, I was just interested in your thoughts on how those currents could play out, could matter here, and obviously in terms of the congressional races as well, or if to some extent for our local governance, they continue to be marginal or irrelevant.
They're definitely not irrelevant trends because, the Republicans could, it's not inconceivable that they could take control again in Albany. I mean, the numbers are not in their favor, obviously. But if there are enough conservative or moderate Democrats, we've seen it before in Albany, that they could conference with Republicans. So it's not just party, and numbers. It's also the type of, the sort of set of beliefs you have. I mean, there are Democrats in the city council who I believe conference with the Republicans, at least a few of them, and I think got more votes on the Republican line when they ran than on the Democratic line, even though they're registered Democrats. So, yeah, I don't think it's an irrelevant trend. I was paying attention as much as I could to the city council special or off-cycle elections this year. And so two stood out to me that I guess stood out to everyone. The Southern Brooklyn seats not only stayed Democratic, but the Democratic councilman won by a much bigger margin than I think people even close to him were expecting. And that's an area, it's Justin Brannan, and that's an area where Republicans have done pretty well and came close to beating him last time. And so I thought, I don't know, not reading like exit polls or interviewing everyone in Bay Ridge. I don't know if that's because he does the local politics and the constituent services well enough to overcome the sort of deficit he has with Republican voters, or if he just ran a great campaign and his opponent didn't. I don't know what happened, but he did really well, which is a good sign for Democrats in swing areas. But then in the Bronx, a Democratic seat flipped to a Republican. And so now you have a Republican in the Bronx, and that seat was held by a Democrat who I think leaned pretty far right before anyway. But that sort of shows that, people who are in a borough that kind of consistently vote, certainly for president, always votes for a Democrat, are now willing to vote Republican. So I think those sort of the smaller, or I should say the down ballot races are really important to watch, because I do think they portend trends, and I don't think it should be taken for granted. I think New York certainly New York City will, in the foreseeable future, I think always be Democratic. Yeah, look, you're right. Kathy Hochul did pretty poorly in a race where her opponent was someone who wasn't just he wasn't like a Rockefeller Republican. He was like a MAGA Trump Republican who tried to help him overturn the election. And he came within 4 or 5 points of winning.
If we could, I guess now pivot. I know we still have to get through a presidential election first, but something about this week, I guess the reporting about Scott Stringer eyeing a run, Catherine Garcia eyeing a run. I said yesterday it would be funny if the literal same exact people in 2021 ran again: Paperboy Prince, Diane Morales, Ray McGuire, Sean Donovan, if his dad has any money left. But I wanted to ask you, looking ahead.
Wait for the letters to Harry. Katie said something that I'm upset about. Texting. Go ahead, Katie.
It was a joke. Let's think about the 2025 mayoral election, right? I know we've all been thinking and speculating, and we have all these people giving, leaking us stuff, and I heard so-and-so. But I guess if you want to think about what 2024 will say about 2025, what these most recent down ballot council elections will say, what the Adams investigations could do, a lot can happen between now and 2025. So I just wanted to get your initial take, what you're thinking, and if you want to even reflect a little bit on about 2021. I don't know if you want to think back to 2021, but it seems is we're off to the races too cliche, and we have a lot of time to get through and a lot of stuff to get through. But if you wanted to start talking about 2025.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think people, it's certainly those who would like to be mayor are thinking about it and talking about it. I don't know if they're raising money yet. I don't know. I guess we haven't had a filing since these investigations really blew up.
Yeah.
But I think it's actually on the minds of anyone who's a New York City political junkie. I think two things come across to me, and I haven't been as in it as I need to be, so I could be missing some people or some things, and maybe you'll get some texts that I'm forgetting someone super important. But I just haven't seen anyone emerge on the left. And I don't just mean during the investigations, just throughout the year, throughout the last 2 years. You have a mayor who's thumbs his nose at the Democratic president, thumbs his nose at progressives, lied to according to the city council, he has his own story, lied to them about budget cuts and kind of tricked them into passing a budget that cut public school funding, is trashing pre-K, which is the one popular thing Bill de Blasio did, is just down the line, really just not a friend to the Democratic Party. It does not seem to matter for his strength electorally to date in New York. His poll numbers are bad, or they're not where they should be for someone who's, got crime that's not super high and a relatively decent economy. They should be better. I think the left in New York is an organizational mess, and I don't think anyone has really stood out And those who I hear about on the left, just it is hard to see them mounting an organized, credible challenge at this moment to Adams. Not because he's so great or so strong, just because I haven't seen that from them. They have to get organized. They have to like build a, kind of repair a coalition that was fractured when the Working Families Party kind of became a bunch of different things. So I'm not like really, I wouldn't be confident if I were them. And their tactics have been bad. There was like a story in the New York Times that they seemed to leak, where the people they wanted to run were then telling the New York Times they're not running. It was just like, it seems like amateur hour. I would be worried if I were Eric Adams, especially if Biden wins again. It's different if Trump wins and the president is an unpopular Republican. If Biden wins in, this year, I would be really worried if I were Eric Adams about a moderate. I mean, it's hard to run as a Republican in New York if you're not wealthy, but I'd be very worried about a personally funded independent, somebody who's going to focus on, no more scandal, just sort of getting the government running, hitting him in the areas where he's vulnerable, which is like, there's an appearance, which is not unfair, that he's out all night and partying. And that is coupled with the fact that he's cutting things. A lot of his signature campaign promises haven't come to fruition. Some things aren't his fault. Like the subway homeless problem is just bigger than he, but it doesn't matter. There's just a perception, I think, that like he's not a great manager right now in a time of, in a time when
leading management and direction.
Yeah. So that's actually where I think he has a bigger vulnerability. I don't know that Catherine Garcia, will be as strong as she was last time, because she's been in the bowels of state government, and that just doesn't usually play well. And as Harry noted, she works for Kathy Hochul, who didn't really do so well. But I think that's where he's more vulnerable. And that's where I would be worried if I were him. I haven't heard a name from that sort of type of candidate emerge yet. But as you said, Sean Donovan's campaign was, just whatever, he got like 2% and spent a ton of money. But someone like that who can tap into resources outside the system, and, maybe someone like a Ray McGuire who, has kind of pull with more moderate voters, or just has the, the sheen of management experience. I think that is a bigger threat to Adams right now than the left.
Well, I mean, it's interesting, Sally. Obviously, you were listening to our podcast while you were working and on vacation. But Harry and I were talking. Harry and I were talking last week, about kind of Adams versus a moderate, because right now Adams versus a progressive. I've always said if one jumps in, they all jump in the pool, and then it's chaos and mayhem, and Adams is relatively fine. I mean, even with federal probes in the background, even with the fact that he is a black mayor, unlike de Blasio, who had federal probes and some other things. But not a Cuomo, but someone who's more like a Cuomo, who can actually go toe-to-toe with Adams, and not in a progressive vein, because what we've seen is that New York is not progressive blue. And with our abysmal turnout numbers, we know that obviously that's not the direction that the vast majority of New Yorkers are going in. And Sean Donovan, my father. I always called him the Meghan McCain of the Democrats. Every sentence was like, my father. And Sean Donovan to me was like, Obama. It's like Sean, Obama, Donovan. Every single time I was like, okay, I get it. But it's like, we need if someone is going to challenge the mayor, I also think that they need some sort of name recognition to a certain extent, because aren't we dealing with the time is of the essence issue? I mean, if we're talking about someone who's not independently funded, don't they need to raise significant amounts of money, essentially by like a July 1, 2024 filing date, to even be a credible person? So if we're not talking about a super rich person, how does that happen? And do you think that New Yorkers are that interested in seeing Eric Adams have a challenger where, let's just say someone pops up in January, February, they could really coalesce and get that kind of money in such a short time, money and attention?
Yeah, it definitely helps if it's someone who's independently wealthy or can tap into resources like that. It helps a lot, because you're right, you do have to build name recognition. And the names that we hear, I guess with the exception of Catherine Garcia, they have, and Cuomo, of course, they have been names that are more on the left, where like a Brad Lander or Jumaane Williams have won citywide. So ostensibly they have some name recognition, but they would not be challenging him. Well, I don't know how they would do their races, but they would not be seen as like moderate managers. They would be challenging him from the ideological left. So it is. I think you're right that it is hard. I think the key for somebody, and ranked choice really changes equations here. So it's hard to game out an election because you don't know like who else is in it, who gets ranked second, that sort of thing. But I think the key electorally is like it's uniting. It's being appealing enough to progressives. And when I say I want to define like I mean the 10 to 15% of people who support like AOC, who support the DSA. I don't mean like the people on the Upper West Side, which I don't think anyone calls them progressives, but to be clear, like, so it's getting
besides
that
themselves. They call themselves progressives.
Do they? Yeah. All right. I didn't even. Yeah. Like what I guess like what we would all call like the kind of center left or the traditional liberals. It's getting them, and there are more of them that they vote in bigger numbers, and the and the sort of farther left progressives, and that might not be enough if you can't. You have to get into Adams' base, and you have to you have to get some black votes. You just have to. Like he has a very loyal base. Again, though, that the polls are not great, and his number among Latinos who don't vote as a monolith by any means, but his number among Latinos in the last poll was terrible. What I think Adams is going for him electorally, if you really if it is a 50-50 race, he does well in smaller kind of pockets of voters that tend to vote one way, like Orthodox Jews. I think the I don't know how many of them are left in a Democratic primary, but the kind of like Staten Island, or Katie would certainly know better, in Queens, like the cops and firefighters who are more conservative but might still vote as Democrats. Like he does well there. He does, the flag raisings that he does, I think are really smart politics, because for like ethnic groups that in certain cases, certainly like with Hasidic Jews, do tend to vote as a bloc, he does his politics really well. So that's another thing that's, and that is ultimately, I think, one of the hardest things about defeating him is like for all of his managerial and seemingly ethical problems, he's a very good politician. Like he just knows how to connect with people. He's talented at that.
You see it, and not just when he has bad news coverage, right? It's sort of been when he was borough president, and then obviously as mayor, but particularly I notice it when there's like a bad story about, FBI took his phones, all this kind of stuff. His weekend schedule it's like a mosque, a Hindu mandir, it's a flag raising, it's a Greek event. It is like a really multi-ethnic, multi-denominational sort of celebration. And he pops in for 10 minutes, he sees them, but that's people who feel seen. And it's marginalized communities who maybe didn't feel as much as, Bill de Blasio probably in his head felt like he was really connecting with people. He really didn't. So you're right that he's such a good politician. And it's true. Like, I don't know. People have said, who on the left? I'm like, the left already doesn't like Mayor Adams. So like, it's a preaching to the choir to keep on a religious theme for a lot of those people. But how could that hypothetical person actually crack into the high voter turnout neighborhoods that maybe do believe Eric Adams is being targeted because he's Black, and just like him and think that he's a great mayor, or at least has been treated poorly and unfairly by the people who they also feel treat them poorly and unfairly. So I don't know who it could be. Like, I don't know. I guess in 2019, if it was like who could run in the 2021 election, there were some names that surprised us, but I don't know who it could be.
And I think you're totally right about him. He benefits in a way from what Trump has said about the investigations against Trump. And I don't think that's only Republicans. There is a sense that like justice systems go too far. I hear it from Democrats all the time. I don't hear it from Democrats about Trump. Of course, they want Trump, gone. But you hear it from Democrats too, where it's like, oh, these prosecutors are being unfair, or they're leaking stuff before they have a case. And so if they don't have indictments, if this case falls apart, it's almost like hard to imagine, only because like it's so dramatic that they went into his car, throughout his details. The actions are extreme. I don't think those things, at least I never heard that those things were happening to de Blasio, who had a multi-layer investigation. But those things are pretty extreme. on the other hand, pay-to-play scandals are pretty hard to convict on. Makes me wonder if it's something else, you know. We hear a lot about foreign agents and so forth. But anyway, to your point, I think that's actually a pretty like powerful line of, or a narrative or a line of defense he has, that like, hey, I'm just being targeted. Like, don't believe what you read. Nothing's happened to me. And I think that does actually resonate with people.
If we could quickly pivot, I know we're nearing the end. Obviously, we're friends, so I hear a lot about your stories and the people you've covered. But for our listeners, we're really going to mind the deep. We're not going to get too therapy. I'm not going to ask about, you know, your relationship with your parents or anything and what you do. But, you know, you've been a reporter. You were a reporter at Rutgers. I don't know if that's when you kind of caught this journalism bug. But is there one particular moment or story, especially in New York City, whether it was when you're at the Advance or the Post, that made you realize, like, I don't want to cover anything else, and this is really, New York is it for me? I don't know if that's too much pressure to think on it, but what sort of story really solidified it for you? If there is just one, and if there's a couple, please share.
You know, I actually loved working at the Staten Island Advance, such a politically different part of New York City. And I had a lot of fun. And I think that is when I knew I wanted to like cover New York City politics. But I think the 2021 mayoral race, coming on the heels of COVID, like this race that was just crazy for so many reasons, like Andrew Yang mixing it up. First time there was ranked choice. It was being run, you know, as a COVID election. The primary was earlier than it had ever been. So all the summer events. Anyway, it was like a really nutty election. It was a lot of fun to cover. And I thought it had resonance nationally. I thought like Adams was important nationally. Now I think he is for different reasons. But it was such a fun and interesting and important race to cover. And it's hard to match that excitement when you're on a national trail. Like, you don't live in the places you're covering. You kind of have to, like, you're just removed. Like, it's very hard to like get in it, you know, and like to know it kind of as instinctively. You have to rely a lot more on other people's intelligence and less on your own gut instincts, unless you've been doing it for a really long time. And so, but I do think covering the mayor's race, I had covered the race in 2009. And the 2009 race is boring. I take that back. I had also covered the race in 2013, and that was kind of interesting. But that 2021 mayor's race was just wild. Like having Diane Morales' staff walk out. I mean, just the whole race was so crazy. And so I think that for me I was like, wow, this will be hard to top. And I have to say, it was hard to top as a reporter.
Well, I'm going to ask a Katie question, which is, I mean, Katie and I talk about food a lot. You all know about Katie's famous article, was it Artichoke Parm?
Yes, but it's not about me. You weren't talking about.
But what was some of the best food you ate while you were away? And what are you looking forward to eating now that you're back?
Oh boy, Chrissy. I mean, I was just really grabbing and going a lot.
All that Iowa cuisine? There's not like a culinary
you can't bring it
scene
up.
in Iowa?
Chrissy, a sensitive subject.
I did have a good Italian meal at a place called Luca in downtown Des Moines that was recommended to me. Apparently, like Obama had, I think, a victory party there, and it was excellent. Yeah, so if you ever find yourself in downtown Des Moines, Luca, good food, really good wine. But it was a lot of like grabbing something at the Hy-Vee and getting on the road because, you know, I joke that, you know, like I live in New York. I commute primarily by subway or on foot. And I drove more in the last year than I've driven in like the last 10 years combined. Just like every campaign stop was like 4 hours across Iowa. So it was definitely a lot of like grabbing a salad or a sandwich at the Hy-Vee and eating in the car.
What's a Hy-Vee? Is that a gas station?
Yeah, it's like the supermarket connected to it. They're pretty nice, actually. Like you could eat like the food there. It's not like going to like a Shell station and like on the Jersey Parkway where you're like, I don't know if I want to eat lunch here. They're actually like pretty nice, but I didn't like generally go out to like, I didn't have a lot of opportunity to sit down and I wasn't at the Iowa State Fair. My colleagues covered it. So I did miss the fried Oreos wrapped in bacon or whatever it is.
Oh.
Sally, we're in the fun part. So I'm going to skip right past if there is a challenge, And yeah, I remember 2017 and Scott Stringer talking about running against Bill de Blasio. It's hard, and his name's, circulating again. It's hard to run against an incumbent mayor, period. So we're going to skip past would it be easier with this imaginary for now challenger in a primary with ranked choice and all that, or potentially in a general, because we have such weird and different systems for these elections and different electorates, and go past that to you're about to be an editor. You've been a reporter for forever. You know how important it is to pin people down. I'm going to try to pin you down in your experience as a reporter, because they're like drivers and pedestrians. Like when you're on one side, you're like, what is wrong with these other people? What's made a good editor or a bad editor in your experience as a reporter? And how are you thinking about what you want to bring to this role as an editor?
Ah, that is a good question. And I'm going to have to be diplomatic, which I'm not good at. My goal, so what I've seen and experienced in my career that I think is really critical for an editor is to walk the reporter through the reporting early on. That is, to me, the biggest problem is like just saying like, yeah, that sounds good. I'll see it later. And then you see the story and you're like, this needs a lot of, like, I think doing the work. I always thought of myself as a reporter over being a writer. Like, it's just what I'm better at and it's what makes me tick. And I love reading great writing and I try to be a very good, clean writer. But like the reason I'm in this business is the love of like the pursuit of information, the reporting. And that needs to happen on the front end. And I think reporters, whether they're 1 year in or veterans, they need to have that, that work of like unpacking a story, figuring out, okay, you have these 3 things, but now you need to like get this document. You need to talk to these people. You need to frame it this way. But if you frame it this way, you need 3 more data points to really beef up whatever it is. Or like figuring out, how much information do we need before we get this out? Because, someone else is working on it and we want to be first, but we want to be most comprehensive. And New York's such a competitive market. Like those, I think doing the work on the front end so that the actual editing of the story is like kind of the most seamless part. That's my goal. It might be a pipe dream, but like you could tell me because you're an editor, like, but I don't want to like get copy because that happened to me on the beat on DeSantis, but it's happened throughout my career where it's like, oh, I thought we talked about this. And it turns out like editors want something completely different or their bosses want something completely different. And the other thing is like, I want to really like empower because I was a reporter up until, a week ago. I really want to like empower reporters. Like if I have ideas, I'll assign them, but I want to hear from them. Like, I don't want to just come in and like, write about this. I care about it. I'm sure I'll do it sometimes, but like, I want to like, draw out of the reporters, like what it is they're hearing, what they think is important. And the thing that I always hated that I know I'm going to do, cause I've already started doing it is like, I'll say like, oh, we should do something on this. Oh, I wrote it last year. Like I've done that too as a reporter, but I think it is important to remember that like people don't remember every story. And certainly in times of like where there's a media crush, like a federal probe or a campaign, like themes have to get hit on again. And like you do need news to justify why you're writing it. But even if you don't have it, you need new angle because I'm like, it's, especially in campaigns, you have to like revisit old stories. And so I think like coming up with creative ways to do that is something I'm going to, that I want to work on. Because no reporter wants to rewrite an old story, which I get. Like, I wouldn't want to either, but sometimes you have to.
As the only non-reporter, I think that that's really important because also you all remember writing certain things. And as a consumer of news, I don't necessarily remember every single story that journalists have written. So it may have been a big deal in the room where you all are, but as just a consumer of news, it's like, maybe we missed it. So I appreciate that kind of rehashing with a new twist. Thank you, Sally CBS, for joining us. Welcome back to New York properly, officially. We look forward to seeing what you do.
Thank you.
Back Monday. Will they see the immediate Sally effect like Monday morning?
Fingers crossed. I have a few days of meetings, so start holding me responsible like Wednesday because I have like 2 days of nonstop meetings in DC or Roslyn. But I know. I'm a suit.
The worst part of being a boss, I'm sure.
I know. Absolutely, yeah. I'm like an anti-meeting person.
Ugh,
but hopefully by mid next week.
Awesome.
Right.
All right. Thanks, Sally.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Sally.
guys.
Thanks,
FAQ. Wow. FAQ NYC is part of The City, a nonprofit, nonpartisan newsroom serving the people of New York. As a nonprofit, we really do depend on your donation to keep going. Our investigations, explainers, FAQ episodes, our reporters and editors, all of it depends on readers and listeners. So please make your gift today. Go to thecity.nyc/give. Any amount helps, but the best way to support is to set up an automatic monthly donation because those really help us plan for the future. And if you already have a monthly donation, you can always make a special extra gift. So go to thecity.nyc/give to make your donation today. Again, that's thecity.nyc/give. Thank you again for listening. As ever, FAQ's work is freely available to everyone at thecity.nyc, and the pod also receives support from P&T Knitwear, an independent bookstore, cafe, and event space on Manhattan's Lower East Side with a podcast studio that can be freely reserved for community use. The podcast is a proud member of the Brickhouse Cooperative of Independent Journalists, Critics, and Artists, and is affiliated with the Colin Powell School at CUNY's City College, where I am one of the Moynihan Public Scholars inaugural fellows. I was, of course, one of the hosts of this episode, along with Katie Honan and Harry Siegel, who's our executive producer, and our engineer is Adam Camara. A special thank you to our guest, Sally Goldenberg of Politico. And thank you, dear listener, for joining us and making it this far. Be kind, be cool, be warm, be well, and we'll be back soon with more.